Hi everyone, it's Rich. I just thought I'd make a quick video as a follow-up to a recent blog post that I did about the advanced photo system, and in particular this little camera, the snappily titled Fuji Fotonex 3500i Zoom. As I said in the blog post, this film format was almost the last hurrah for film photography as consumers knew it. Digital cameras were becoming more widely available, their sensor quality was getting higher, and the cost, most importantly, was coming down. I remember buying my first digital camera in 2001 whilst I was on my honeymoon, and it boasted a whopping 2.1 million pixels. But the pictures and the convenience of using digital was quite apparent from the off. This little camera was given to me a few weeks back by a friend of mine as we were clearing out her late father's camera collection. In later life, he shot a lot of digital photography, as many people do now, but this camera would have been the last one that he went out and bought sometime in the late 90s, early 2000s. She told me that he was particularly proud of this camera because of how clever it was, and that, I guess, is the main thing about APS. APS was developed as a more convenient film format for consumer shooters. APS film was discontinued about 10 years ago, and most of the manufacturers had abandoned the format and their camera manufacturer long before that. So why am I interested in this little camera? Well, I guess it's because I've never really looked into the format. I certainly haven't shot it before. My understanding is that because the negatives are smaller on the film, the image resolution when you blow them up is lower. That makes sense. But it is more high quality than 110, for example, and it's certainly higher resolution than the ill-fated Kodak disc format. The other reason, quite simply, is that it is now in my collection and it works. I put a battery in and everything fired up as you'd expect. It was certainly not a cheap manufactured camera when it was made, as you would expect from Fujifilm. It's actually quite nicely put together, very elegant looking, and it has a few quite clever little features that I'll talk about in a minute. Looking at the camera, the front is covered up by this single panel. The top has got very few controls on it, and the back is equally simple design. The lens cover is actually this entire front panel. So if I take that off, you will see the camera revealed behind it. And as we can see, it is a Fujifilm 3500 IX zoom. It has a 21 to 58 millimeter Fujinon zoom lens. The only other information is that it is an advanced photo system camera. Everything else looks fairly conventional: flash gun, viewfinder, little LED in the front there for self-timer. And yeah, it's a pretty straightforward looking thing, but quite a pretty camera when you look at it. The clever bit is actually the panel that I took off. So here is the panel that I removed to reveal the front of the camera. If I turn it round, you can see that it calls itself a multifunction card, which is a good description because this allows you to do a number of things with the camera. The first being it acts as an infrared remote control, which is quite clever. From the front of the camera, you can point and take pictures with this card. The second function that it has is it allows you to time and date stamp your pictures, which was very popular in the 1990s. And the final one, which I've not explored yet really, is that it allows you to imprint some messaging on your films. This card, when it's not in use, actually becomes part of the camera on the back. So you can see this ridge along the front where it docks. If I turn the camera around, the multifunction card actually slots into a similar panel on the back. And when you do that, it wakes the camera up. So just ignore this little bit of gaffer tape here that's holding the panel onto the battery compartment. The plastic was quite brittle when I got the camera and tried to replace the batteries. Not really a surprise given that it is quite old now. The rest of it though is in pretty good condition. So as I said, the film format is long dead, but thanks to eBay and other online sites, you can still pick up expired film for APS cameras and you can still shoot it. There are in fact a couple of places that you can also get it developed, although it should be said that the film processor that went with it is probably not going to be used in the lab that you take it to. With APS, the cameras would write onto the film the details of how it was shot. So if you shot a landscape on one frame and a portrait on another frame, the camera would make a record of that on the film. When the film was taken to the lab, the machine that was used to process it would read that information back. You still had a full negative, but the print that was made from that negative would be set to whatever your selection was when you were shooting it. With 35mm, you would get a series of prints from the whole roll, and your negatives would be divided into strips and you would be given that back. With APS, the film was actually stored in the canister that it was shot in. So what you got back was you got a canister with your film in it, and you had a contact sheet with all the pictures that were on the film as little icons, and you would choose which ones you wanted to print and what format you wanted them printed in, and then the processor would make that decision later on. So the real benefit of that was that you could store your film safely in its can, and you could select the prints as and when you wanted them, rather than being given everything that was on the film and the film itself back. The other advantage in later cameras, and this camera actually does it, is you could take a roll out when it was partially shot. You could tell the camera to wind the film back in to the canister, take it out, put a different film stock in, shoot some of that, and then when the lighting conditions were right for your original film, you could swap them back again. The camera could automatically work out where it was when you were last shooting it and carry on from there. A really flexible system, which is what APS was intended to be. Easy for the consumer to use with the benefits of complete flexibility in choosing and shooting film stocks. Of course, as we know, the problem was it was all about a decade too late. By the time this got going, the digital cameras were becoming more widely available and people were beginning to realise the benefits of not having to spend money on the medium itself. So I went onto eBay and I bought this Kodak Avantix 200 speed film for the APS system. It still has its original sticker on there, which is not what I paid for it. The film was 25 exposures instead of 24 or 36 as with 35mm, but a good speed to have, and Kodak obviously being one of the big manufacturers, you could guarantee the film quality was going to be pretty good. So here's the film canister, and the first thing you'll notice is there's no film tail hanging out the end of it. If I compare that with a roll of 35mm Ferrania, the film tail is there, and you can load a 35mm film into a camera. You have to pull that little leader across the back of the camera to the take-up spool, and then you would wind the camera on to the first frame and start shooting. As I mentioned earlier, APS was intended to be a self-loading cartridge in a way that sort of harks back to the 126 film of the 1950s and 60s. Go ahead and load this camera. If I turn it onto its back, you can see this little door on the left-hand side here where Fuji are suggesting using their film, not surprisingly. This is where the film goes, and you can see the shape of the canister marked on the top there. Open the back by pushing on this little lever, and then you can see the inside of the compartment. This canister and compartment are shaped so that it can only be installed one way around, again making it as easy for the consumer as possible. So what you literally have to do is drop it in there, make sure it's seated, close the door. The 25 indicates the number of frames on the film, and that number will go down as you take more pictures. Eventually the camera will have wound the film entirely back into the canister. When we look at the other control on the top here, you can see the format select. Now this format selector allows you to change between the different aspect ratios that the camera will shoot, and it doesn't really matter what you choose on here. The camera just records that information on the film. You still get a full negative when you shoot any frame on this camera. All that does is code the choice that you made at the time. So it is now ready to go. Literally power button, shutter button, multifunction card, zoom lens, and that's it. Simple as that. So the next step is to go out and shoot this roll of film. This roll expired in 2011, which is pretty much the end of the production run of APS film. I'm not expecting the results to be particularly well exposed because the film's sensitivity has degraded over that decade. The usual rule of thumb observed by lots of film photographers is to overexpose by a stop of light for every decade that a film is out of date. Unfortunately, this little camera doesn't have the ability to override the ISO setting. It reads the ISO setting directly from the can. It also doesn't have any kind of exposure compensation, so I am looking at probably one stop underexposed for the results. But I am keen to see what they look like, so I will be shooting this roll and having it developed, and I will share the results when I have them. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this little whiz through APS and the blog that goes with it, which you can find at my website, www.richperspective.co.uk. The camera is going into my collection, which currently stands at 48 cameras. I am in the process of creating a YouTube channel where I am going to review the more interesting cameras from my collection. Rather than being a technical review and this button does this function, I'm going to be talking more about my experience of buying the camera, the decisions that I made, why did I buy it in the first place, what it's like to live with, and where it fits in photographic history. I don't normally collect cameras that don't have some form of historical context. With this camera, APS was obviously a system, however short-lived, that made an impact on camera design. The electronics and the functionality of cameras increased dramatically with APS, I would say. The only disadvantage to it really was the fact that it was overtaken by the more modern digital technology. So keep your eyes peeled. I will be posting updates on the development of videos from my channel, but thanks again for watching and see you soon.